Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns on a day when strange things are happening with our $1 million equipment. But that's the way it is. We have a first-time guest, and I don't know why she has not been here in 16 years, but I'm really happy to have Roxanne Givens with us, who is a household word in her own household and and elsewhere throughout the Minneapolis area. I mean, you are 6 generations in Minneapolis. You have a very famous father. You are, in your own right, famous. You are founder of the first African American Museum and Cultural Center that you've been struggling with for a half dozen years. So I really want to welcome you. This is long overdue.
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me to be here, Alan, and congratulations on your long run, 15 and a half years, almost 16 years with Access. So congratulations.
Well, my long run is the benefit of, or has been benefited by many lucky breaks, and that's life. Now, Roxanne's had a tough day. She was supposed to get her daughter off at the airport for what she thought was a particular flight. Her daughter missed her flight. We've had equipment breakdown. I pointed out in an earlier interview that I went through a 4-hour basal cell carcinoma earlier this week, which wasn't a pleasant experience. And again, I urge you, use SPF 46 and above if you're going to be out in the sun, which I never did, and it came back to haunt me. But let's talk about you.
Okay, sounds good.
Talk about the museum, and I know you've worked so hard for a half dozen years at least to get this museum going.
Thank you, Alan, for that. Collectively, it really, truly has been a community effort. So we have several founders of the museum that have worked just nonstop around the clock to make this museum a reality. And as one of the visionaries, it has always been my goal to be able to reach that mountaintop, to see this museum through. If you had said, Alan, 6 years ago that there was going to be one barrier and then a roadblock, that it was going to be like Minnesota construction all year round for 6 years, I wouldn't have believed it over a museum. But that's what's happened. And so the beauty about that is the resilience of a new organization to be able to respond and have that tenacity.
And it will be open.
It absolutely.
And we will be there.
Thank you. It will.
Certainly, hopefully. And it will be a first in Minnesota, a repository of, among other things, 50,000 items from your father, the late Archie Givens. And tell us a little bit about him and what that means to the museum.
Well, we, as a family, have the Archie Givens literature collection, which is housed at the University of Minnesota. And we like to think that at some point we will collaborate with the Givens collection and be able to exhibit some of those books and artifacts. We are planning a children's village on the top floor, and that is an early learning literacy center for kids from 0 to 6 years of age. And they will be able to access these volumes of literature that have been written by or they are exclusively about African American culture. And so we have numerous opportunities for cross-fertilization, and that's one of the things that we look forward to. But it's not just, the museum is called the Minnesota African American Museum, so it could have been named anything, but it is for the community. It is for Minnesota to honor. There are so many individuals that we don't even know about, and if we get to share that at some
Well,
point,
when I was
will.
reading up on background
Yes.
of you, a name jumped out at me, Carl Rowan.
Yes.
Now, in 1951, my family lived here for 2 years. I am not a native Minnesotan. You might not have known that from the accent. But I got a summer job with what was then the Star, the Tribune, the Morning Tribune. The Star was a separate afternoon paper.
That's right.
And the most famous columnist that we had was Carl Rowan. And I got to know him in a very particular way, where some of the editors would say, "Boy," and call me over and say, "Get me a cup of coffee." Carl Rowan was always a gentleman, was always gentle, was always informative. He wanted to know what I was studying at Syracuse and things. And so it really was fond memories of that summer. I don't have fond memories of a lot of the other people who were in the Tribune at the time, but Carl Rowan is one that stuck with me, and I saw his name in the materials that you have. So
Yes, Carl Rowan is one of the pioneers that we will be featuring. We are featuring a dozen pioneers initially, and what that means is that these individuals will tour the school systems, the Minneapolis and the St. Paul public schools, as what we call trunket characters. They will come alive to these students, to the young people, and they will understand the underpinnings of a Carl Rowan, what motivated him, and to know that you can write in newspapers, you can be a phenomenal reporter. And at a time in the 50s where really that was very rare, unless you were in a ethnic specific run newspaper.
But we had some unusual people in Minnesota then. We had a fellow by the name of Hubert Humphrey in Minnesota. And look at the doors that he opened. And look at the doors he opened in terms of even Jewish Americans.
Yes.
I know, being Jewish and learning a little bit about the background here, of the prejudice that Jews suffered here, that blacks suffered here, that minorities suffered here. And this is something that hasn't gone away completely, but we've made such strides, except maybe in Missouri this week, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes.
Certainly.
But
well, you mentioned the Jewish community, and just recently the museum has some dynamic new leadership, a new board chair, new executive director, but the Mount Sinai organization, which is the first hospital in the state of Minnesota to accept not only African American patients, but physicians. And as we know that was the foundation was exclusively Jewish, and we are very excited to be collaborating with them on the historic research related to those physicians and some of the patients. So those are the wonderful opportunities that present themselves to us. And Alan, it's incredible to not have the doors open. We have got incredible programming, and in spite of everything, people come to us as the go-to for anything to do with Minnesota-based African American history, and we're very proud of that.
But you have been so involved in so many civic and charitable endeavors in this state that it's not surprising to me that people go to you. You know, I mention your name to just about anybody, and everybody knows Roxanne.
They may not
And-
jump up and down about it, but they know me, right?
Yeah,
No,
but you
I'm-
know,
yeah.
you have survived, you have been tenacious. The museum is a perfect example. You have stuck with this concept through all sorts of problems, legal and otherwise, and it is something that's going to not only be part of your soul, but it's going to be something that's available for all the people of this state.
Ellen, that's very nice. That is just an incredible statement, because sometimes we lose sight during the struggle of the mission and the purpose, and it is to educate everybody about so many achievements. Everybody, Frederick McKinley Jones, an inventor here in Minnesota at Thermo King, which is now an incredible corporation, but he was the basis for Thermo King and their fiscal popularity and the growth of their business as a result of this African American inventor who developed the refrigeration process. Who knows that? And so Frederick McKinley Jones is going to be one of those characters that tours and goes to the schools so that the kids, and all kids, because it's not just for African American kids, but can you imagine the diversity, the melting pot that we have in our public school systems now? And I'm only saying public, it's for everybody, but we're working collaboratively with some of the public schools. And they hear about this Frederick McKinley Jones, for an example. And really? Are you kidding? I thought you just got here in 1960 and you had somebody that invented this and that, and it just,
We know
the perceptions.
that education is the answer to a lot of our problems, to a
Yes.
lot of the bigotry that we certainly have experienced, and really to people being able to advance themselves, so that the museum in its own way, and I know you've been very involved in education in various forms, you have gotten more citations and awards than most people even imagine in their lifetime.
Oh.
And it's not because you haven't been involved. You have been involved since very early in your life.
It is really a family legacy, that involvement. But it's not a but. The struggle is very similar. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it seems as though history kind of repeats itself literally. And the museum's purpose is to kind of talk about that historical fiction and make it a reality, a nonfiction. Because as much as we want to change history, it is what it is, but a lot of it can be very positive.
The sad thing is that we keep repeating
This is
the
very sad.
mistakes of our history over and over and over again. And a perfect example is what's going on in Missouri as we speak. An unarmed teenager was shot and killed, apparently multiple shots,
Multiple times.
and killed by a white police officer. And we've had all sorts of riots this week. I was appalled to see the initial response with machine guns and snipers on top of cars and tear gas and stun grenades. And yes, people overreacted, as they did 40 years ago, and it's the same thing. Why don't we learn? That's the question.
We don't learn, Alan, because we don't know history. And I speak of that collectively. Just think, was it 50 years ago, Emmett Till? My goodness, he was visiting his grandmother. This young fella was visiting his
He
grandmother.
was on his way to see his
Right,
grandmother.
Right, and it's just, it's incredible. What happens, unfortunately, is when you are not aware of your past, whosever past it is, you can't connect the dots to the future. And we have a tendency to, and I'll describe that, has gone on for so long that sometimes we forget life can be a different way. one of our historians said, you know, there doesn't have to be a back door for us to go in. Sometimes we'll cut the back door in ourselves because we're so used to that type of treatment. In this particular case, you have a city, Ferguson, that has 70% African American population with 3, not 3%, 3 African American police officers.
Out of a, I think, 58 or 60 man force.
How does that happen? And what are the policies, and what do the policies look like? So policies have to change. We have, you know, I said to someone, because I've been talking to people in St. Charles, Missouri, and all over, and I said, because people don't even know the history, there's something about the context of riot and what it means has not changed either. If you remember in the 60s, it seemed here in Minneapolis, we went into our own communities and sort of destroyed them. And so initially we thought that that was going to happen in Fergus. Some of the African American owned businesses would be put out of business because of this.
Several were destroyed.
And several
Yeah.
were destroyed. But you see, it's repeating itself, and we've said there's another way. There's a different approach to this. But without leadership, in absence of leadership, we're sort of left to our own, what would you say, left to our own
Designs, I
yes,
guess.
left to our own designs, and without a context, that gets us
When
nowhere.
we talk about education, those police who
Yes.
overreacted were never educated in the type of crowd control or how they should respond to a situation like this. So the fault doesn't lie completely on the people who rioted, because by the
Not at all.
second night, they were standing around and they were set upon. Reporters were arrested. There were 2 reporters who were filing stories from a McDonald's,
Right,
and
they were
a
arrested.
policeman walked in, first tried to get them to stop, second tried to get them to identify themselves when they had credentials hanging around their neck, third gave the manager of the McDonald's 30 seconds to close the place down for the night. I mean, this is reprehensible.
It is reprehensible, and I hope that I didn't lead anyone to think that I certainly support the mission and the passion and the process of what occurred, natural outrage. My position is, how do we collectively, as a community, as a society, allow a community that is 70% African American to have this occur with 3 individuals on their police force? How do we not have specialized training? How do we not anticipate, you know?
Look at the mayor, look at the town council. Why is there not representation? Whose fault is that? Is it the fault of the black community there in not pushing more? Is it the fault of the white community in suppressing people because they're so used to it for centuries of suppression?
That's the
I mean,
back
we
door.
don't know.
Mhm.
And it comes back to what I said before, education. Look what we have here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have gangs. We have kids, teenagers running around with guns, and they're taking out their aggressions
Right.
by killing people. It's insane.
You know, Alan, in a place like Minnesota, Minneapolis, what's occurring is a different brand of suppression, of racism. It used to be a little bit more overt, and it has to do with how policies are established. So we can't say that it's African Americans that, you know, allowed this to occur because they didn't. When you're not at the table, you don't know what is going on. And how do you get invited to the table when historically you have been excluded? So how is that
you could
process?
be a server, and they can call you in from the kitchen.
There you
that
go.
would be the historical way to do it.
There you go, and we
But-
know that happened here in Minnesota. At Lake Minnetonka, one of our, Frederick Douglass, was a server in one of the exclusive enclaves, but he learned from the experience.
And he certainly did, and,
Yeah.
and became, went on to become an educator. And, I see the difference between these gangs and some of the students that we have at MCTC and other institutions, where there's a genuine desire to better oneself, to get ahead, to make the world, the country, the city, the state a better place. And then there are these youths who are so frustrated because they feel they have no future, and they resort to violence. And that's the problem that we certainly have not been able to overcome.
It's interesting. We talk about there is a college-educated African American graduate, and there is a non-African American that served prison time. And the non-African American that served prison time will get the job before an African American college graduate. I can only speak for the state of Minnesota. It occurs in the state of Minnesota. I don't know about, but can you imagine a misdemeanor? Well, now marijuana is going to be legalized, right? But 10 years ago, you have a little bit of marijuana.
Well, how many tens of thousands
That's what I'm going to
of
say.
young African Americans are in jail today because of minor drug charges, as opposed to whites? Now, we know it's an 8-to-1 or a 9-to-1 ratio.
And what do they lose? They lose their voting privileges. They lose the opportunity for for the development of their own personal economic development. And that is a loss. I mean, all of these things are almost, all of the values I grew up embracing have been taken away collectively from masses of individuals. And if you don't, I'm going to go back to history, if you don't know that you can overcome some of these things because you don't have modeled behavior, it would be a land of despair. And so what you need is you need to be able to model. You need to be able to see that there are successes. You need to be able to see that there are not successes, that there are these challenges and barriers that must be overcome. The question I always ask, and our board in the past, the founding board in the past has always said, well, is this about empowerment? Because once you have information, you're really empowered. And maybe that information is almost too empowering because of the way our systems have been allowed. Alan, the Minnesota African American Museum will become, when the doors finally open again, the first African American owned cultural arts organization, cultural organization, to be owned by an African American entity in the state of Minnesota. That's pretty major. Most of the organizations that you think of
And
that
we're
provide
talking about
arts,
2014 at the present time, right?
absolutely. Most
Yeah.
of them, they are phenomenal. I have nothing to, this is just a fact. Spaces are leased, no spaces are owned. Now you have this organization who actually acquired the property for over $1 million and didn't, say, here, give me, but kind of went through an appropriate process. You have to wonder if there are some other underlying, issues, and I don't know that there are, and all we want to do is move forward and open.
There, and we know that they exist, and they don't just exist for African Americans, they exist for minorities of many persuasions. And, there was a comedian who, I think he just won the last comic standing or something like that. And he had some bit where somebody came back from hundreds of years ago. And
that's clever.
He's looking at Washington and he said, wait a second, isn't that the White House? Who's that standing there? Is that one of Jefferson's children? And it was such a riff on where we are culturally that it was just a great way,
Very
and he
weird.
was African American. So,
You know, we have a society that is really highly organized around racial inequality. That's just, you know, ethnic inequality, cultural inequality. It is the way, it is the historic way. And I think people want to take this magic marker and just make it go away, and it's impossible. So what you do is you work with it, understand it, so that we're not in a position to allow history to repeat itself. What I'm finding in time is that you have the law and you have politics. When I was growing up, the law was really a balance of justice and equality. Today, the law is here and politics are here. Politics is beginning to trump the law.
and unfortunately, our political system
Absolutely.
is so rigged in
Getting ready to
terms
say
of
that.
who is running it and representation. Is there a senator who isn't a millionaire? Well, Paul Wellstone wasn't, and he's gone. But if they're not when they start out, they certainly become that soon enough. You look at the House of Representatives and you realize, and you look at the lobbyists and you look at the corporations, and I guess this is a complaint about the system in general, but what chance does the little guy have?
Yeah.
Well, a Keith Ellison has a chance.
Keith Ellison is doing
And
wonderful things.
but, you know, there are not enough people with the drive of a Keith Ellison or a Roxanne Givens because they don't think that they can succeed, and they're not willing to undertake the challenges and fail.
That's, you hit upon to fail. That is amazing. Absolutely. I think there, and I was a friend of mine, they have a fear, sometimes you have a fear of success, and that blocks us, but that fear wasn't internal. That fear was given to us by a biased political system, by Minnesota, the highest achievement gap, the highest employment gap. We're back to housing. Housing as a crisis after Humphrey went through what he went through
Yeah.
in the state of Minnesota. And you
And we're
begin-
back to our last 45 seconds. So
Oh
this
my
is,
goodness.
This is a conversation that is going to have to be continued down the road, but you've got to come back. We've got to continue this.
Well, thank you for having me.
And we've got to have, we've got to watch the progress of the museum. And really, we've been talking with Roxanne Givens. You have 30 seconds for any last thoughts.
Well, I just want to say thank you. And yes, you know, people have called me and they said, what can we do about this museum? How can we make this happen? And I say, if you're ever in a position, if you're at the table where a decision is being made about policy, that's how you change. That's how you impact what should be right.
And I thank you. And as I said, to be continued, because we have a long way to go.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.